Breaking news war has erupted in the Pacific. U.S. and Chinese warships clash in contested waters. Missiles locked, crews on edge. Could this be the first battle of World War III? What you're about to hear is the untold story of how the superpowers came within seconds of firing the first shots that could have changed history forever. Chapter 1: The Waters of Uncertainty. The South China Sea, stretching across nearly 3.5 million square kilometers, is one of the world's most vital and contested waterways. At first glance, its shimmering blue waters and countless coral reefs might seem like a tropical paradise, dotted with fishing boats and merchant ships. But beneath the surface lies a region teetering on the edge of confrontation, a maritime arena where history, national pride, and strategic ambition collide. For centuries, these waters were shared by fishermen from nations like the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and China. Generations depended on its bountiful catch of tuna, grouper, and shellfish. But today, this once open sea has transformed into a chessboard of power. Where modern warships replace fishing boats and patrol planes trace invisible lines of control in the sky above. At the heart of this region lies the Scarborough Shoal, a triangle-shaped reef system located roughly 120 nautical miles west of the Philippine island of Luzon. To local fishermen, it's long been a rich source of livelihood, a place to cast nets and haul in fresh catches to feed their families. But to Beijing, Scarborough Shoal is far more than a fishing ground. China calls it Wangyan Dao and insists that it has been part of its territory since ancient times. To Manila, however, it falls well within the country's exclusive economic zone. As defined by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, this conflicting claim has made the shoal one of the most volatile flashpoints in modern geopolitics. Why is this patch of sea so important? The answer lies in geography and economics. The South China Sea is a maritime superhighway. Roughly 1/3 of the world's trade passes through its waters every year. Oil, gas, raw materials, and finished goods worth trillions of dollars. Beneath the seabed, geologists estimate vast reserves of oil and natural gas, resources that could fuel economies for generations. Whoever controls these waters does not just gain access to fish and reefs, they gain leverage over global commerce and strategic advantage in Asia. For China, dominance of the South China Sea serves multiple purposes. It extends their military reach, secures trade routes, and symbolizes the country's resurgence as a great power after centuries of foreign intrusion. For the United States, however, freedom of navigation here is non-negotiable. Washington sees the South China Sea not as a Chinese lake, but as international waters governed by global law. And so, the U.S. Navy patrols, sailing warships like the USS Higgins directly through disputed zones to prove that no nation can claim ownership of international sea lanes. This tension is not new. In 2012, a standoff erupted between Chinese and Philippine vessels at Scarborough Shoal. For weeks, ships faced off in a game of maritime chicken. Eventually, China seized de facto control of the shoal, blocking Filipino fishermen and leaving Manila humiliated. That episode hardened Beijing's resolve and sent a chilling message across Southeast Asia. China would not hesitate to flex its muscle to enforce its claims. Then came 2016, when the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague ruled against Beijing's sweeping 9-line claim, a U-shaped boundary that covers nearly the entire South China Sea. The court declared that China's claim had no legal basis and affirmed the Philippines' rights over waters near Scarborough. The ruling should have been a decisive blow to Beijing's narrative. But instead of backing down, China rejected the verdict outright, calling it null and void. From then on, Chinese patrols and warships became a constant presence in contested areas. The United States watched closely. For Washington, the South China Sea is more than a regional dispute. It's a litmus test for the global order. If China can unilaterally rewrite maritime rules here, what prevents it from doing the same elsewhere? Thus, the U.S. Navy stepped up its freedom of navigation operations, FONUPs, deliberately sailing through disputed zones to challenge China's growing control. It was during one such mission near the Scarborough Shoal that the USS Higgins entered the stage. A modern Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, bristling with advanced radar, Tomahawk cruise missiles, and anti-submarine systems. The Higgins symbolized not just American firepower, but also the principle of open seas. When it charted a course through the contested waters, the U.S. Navy wasn't just patrolling it, was making a statement to the world. No single nation dictates who sails these waters. But the South China Sea is not just a chessboard, it's a powder keg. Every maneuver, every radio call, every shadowing warship carries with it the risk of escalation. A reckless move or a miscalculated turn could turn maritime tension into full-blown disaster. And so, as the USS Higgins entered the disputed waters of Scarborough Shoal, the stage was set. Beijing's warships were already on alert. The world was about to witness a high-stakes encounter that would not only test the resolve of two great powers, but also shake the fragile balance of peace across the entire Indo-Pacific. The question was not simply who would turn away. The question was, how far would each side go to defend its claim? Chapter 2. The Arrival of the Higgins. The morning skies over the South China Sea were deceptively calm. A soft haze lingered on the horizon, blurring the distant outlines of reefs and shoals that had, for years, been at the center of an international storm. Below the surface of that serene blue, the waters concealed not only rich fisheries and vital shipping lanes, but also the ambitions of nations. Into this charged environment steamed the USS Higgins DDG-76, a U.S. Navy Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, bristling with radar domes, missile launchers, and the quiet confidence of a warship built for power projection. For the sailors aboard, this was more than just another day at sea. The Higgins had been tasked with one of the most sensitive missions in modern naval operations, a freedom of navigation operation, FONOP. These missions, routine in theory, carry enormous symbolic weight in practice. By sailing through contested waters without requesting permission, the U.S. asserts that these lanes remain international commons, not the private domain of any one country. The contested area today was near Scarborough Shoal, a triangular chain of rocks and reefs just west of the Philippines. Scarborough is not only rich in fish, but sits strategically at the gateway to the Luzon Strait, one of the most important sea passages linking the Pacific to the South China Sea. Beijing claims it as its own, citing historic rights, while Manila sees it as lying squarely within its exclusive economic zone, EEZ. The 2016 International Tribunal ruling had dismissed China's sweeping claims, but Beijing had never budged. As the Higgins glided closer, the ship's captain and bridge officers were already on high alert. Intelligence reports warned that Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy planned vessels were conducting constant patrols in the area. It was not a matter of if they would encounter Chinese ships, it was a matter of when. The mood on the bridge was tense but disciplined. Sailors scanned radar screens, listening intently to the crackle of radio traffic. The Higgins crew knew they would be challenged. The real question was, how far would China go this time? Suddenly, a contact appeared on the radar-plan frigate, moving in from the west. Minutes later, a second contact, larger and faster, joined from the south. The Higgins had drawn attention. The Chinese ships were converging, tightening their approach like wolves circling prey. The radio operator broke the silence. A heavily accented voice rang out in English. "Us warship, you are entering Chinese territorial waters. Leave immediately or you will bear responsibility for the consequences." The words were sharp, rehearsed, and unmistakably threatening. The captain of the Higgins responded with calm precision, his voice steady. "This is the United States Navy warship operating in accordance with international law. We are conducting lawful operations in international waters." The exchange was routine, yet loaded with meaning. Each word represented the collision of two worldviews, one that insisted the sea belonged to all, and another that claimed it as national territory. From the deck, sailors could now see the Chinese vessels with the naked eye. Gray holes cut the water, closing the distance, their naval ensigns snapping in the wind. The planned ships were maneuvering aggressively, placing themselves in the Higgins' path, shadowing her every move. To the casual observer, the maneuvers might have looked like a high-stakes dance at sea. To naval officers, however, they were something far more dangerous. Gray zone tactics designed to intimidate without crossing the line into outright conflict. Inside the Combat Information Center kick of the Higgins, radar operators tracked every move. Computers calculated distance, bearing, and speed. Alarms were set to warn if the Chinese ships came within dangerously close proximity. The destroyer's crew drilled for this very scenario, knowing that one wrong move, one miscalculation, could mean disaster. On the deck, sailors felt the weight of history. The South China Sea has long been a maritime chessboard, but now as they looked across the waters at the looming silhouettes of Chinese warships, it felt like they were standing on the front line of a struggle far larger than themselves. The Chinese ships weren't just trying to push the Higgins away, they were sending a message to the world. This is our sea. Foreign navies are not welcome here. And yet, the Higgins stayed its course. Its powerful engines churned steadily, refusing to be bullied or diverted. Every meter forward was an act of defiance, a demonstration that international waters remain open. But tension hung thick in the salty air. Radios crackled again. Chinese voices repeated their warnings, growing more insistent. The Higgins responded the same way each time: calm, professional, unyielding. Neither side fired a shot, but the battle had already begun, one of nerves, resolve, and calculated brinkmanship. As the Higgins pressed deeper into the contested zone, the world's most dangerous question echoed silently across the bridge. What happens if the Chinese decide to push just a little harder? This was no ordinary patrol. This was a showdown, inching closer to the brink. And in that moment, the arrival of the Higgins transformed the calm waters of Scarborough Shoal into a stage where superpowers tested each other's willpower while the rest of the world watched, holding its breath. Chapter 3. The Chinese Challenge. The ocean that morning seemed deceptively calm, its waves glistening under the harsh South China Sea sun. But beneath the surface of that calm lay an invisible line, one not marked on any official map, yet guarded with iron determination by Beijing's navy. The USS Higgins was now well within striking distance of that line. And as history has shown, once the U.S. Navy pushes into these contested waters, the People's Liberation Army Navy plan does not sit idly by. It began subtly. Radar operators aboard the Higgins picked up faint signals, multiple contacts rapidly closing the distance. The bearings matched known planned patrol patterns. The bridge crew tightened, their routine discipline blending with heightened awareness. Then, over the horizon, they appeared, gray silhouettes cutting across the shimmering sea. Two Chinese warships, their banners red and gold, bearing down on the American destroyer with unmistakable intent. At first, the planned ships held a parallel course, shadowing the Higgins at a cautious distance. But quickly, their maneuvers shifted. The Chinese captains steered closer, matching the Higgins' speed. Their bows pointed deliberately toward the American vessel in a silent message. "We are watching you. You are not welcome here." Inside the Combat Information Center of the Higgins, sailors monitored every move. The tension was palpable, though unspoken. On one screen, the electronic warfare officer tracked Chinese radar pings locking onto the destroyer. On another, a live feed from the ship's bridge cameras revealed the Chinese vessels creeping closer. Then came the voice, crackling through the radio in Mandarin-accented English, sharp and commanding. "Us warship, you are trespassing in Chinese territorial waters. Leave immediately, or you will bear full responsibility for any consequences." The message repeated again and again, growing sharper with each transmission. But aboard the Higgins, the response was calm, deliberate. Rehearsed countless times, This is United States warship conducting lawful operations in accordance with international law. We will continue on our planned course. To the American crew, it was a matter of principle. To the Chinese captains, it was a matter of national pride. The standoff escalated. One of the planned warships broke formation, steering across the Higgins bow at an alarmingly close distance, barely 150 yards away. The maneuver was aggressive, calculated to intimidate. U.S. sailors on deck watched as the Chinese ship's wake foamed violently, its metal hull gleaming only a few football fields away. The Higgins did not yield. Instead, her captain ordered a slight course adjustment to maintain safety without signaling retreat. It was a delicate dance, to stand firm without sparking a collision that could ignite an international incident. As the planned vessels continued their dangerous circling, sailors aboard the Higgins could feel the weight of history pressing down on them. They were not just holding a line on a chart, they were standing at the crossroads of global power. The U.S. destroyer, a symbol of Washington's resolve, was being tested in real time by a rising superpower determined to rewrite the rules of the sea. This wasn't the first time such maneuvers had happened, but the aggressiveness was undeniable. In past encounters, Chinese ships had trailed from a distance. Now they were pressing harder, pushing boundaries with precision and confidence. Beijing's message was clear: this is our sea, and we will defend it not only with words, but with steel. For the sailors aboard the Higgins, the sound of the ocean was drowned out by the hum of engines, the static of radio chatter, and the tension that seemed to crackle in the very air. A single miscalculation and engine failure, a misinterpreted maneuver, or even a slip of human judgment could send steel colliding with steel, turning a tense standoff into the spark of war. Every sailor understood the stakes. The South China Sea was no ordinary body of water. It was the world's busiest maritime highway, carrying 1/3 of global trade. If conflict erupted here, the consequences would ripple far beyond the horizon. The Chinese warships pressed on, circling closer, their radar beams sweeping across the Higgins like invisible searchlights. To the outside world, it was just another maneuver in disputed waters. But to those who lived it, to the sailors staring across the narrow strip of sea at the eyes of their counterparts, felt like standing on the edge of a knife. One gust of wind away from disaster. The Higgins held course. The planned ships shadowed relentlessly. And the world, though unaware in that very moment, was inching closer to a dangerous truth. In the South China Sea, the game of brinkmanship had no referee and no safety net. Chapter 4. Close Calls at Sea. The South China Sea shimmered beneath the blazing midday sun. The horizon stretched endlessly, broken only by scattered reefs and the silhouettes of ships weaving across the contested waters. On radar, blips pulsed with meaning, each one representing not just steel and weaponry, but the ambitions of nations. On the bridge of the USS Higgins, tension thickened like the humid air. Every officer and sailor knew they were not just sailing through contested waters, they were making a statement. The destroyer's course was deliberate, slow but steady reminder of the United States' stance. These seas are open to all, no matter what Beijing claims. But in warships, seconds matter. And in the vastness of the ocean, distance can shrink alarmingly fast. The approach, a Chinese vessel that had been shadowing the Higgins for hours, suddenly changed its behavior. Previously content to circle and tail from a safe distance, the planned Luoyang-class destroyer now surged forward. Cutting through the water with menacing intent, spray flew off its bow as the crew on deck appeared in sharp formation, binoculars raised, cameras rolling, and radios alive with warnings. Unidentified U.S. naval vessel, you are violating Chinese territorial waters. Change course immediately, or face consequences. The radio crackled, the Mandarin-laced English voice cold, almost rehearsed. On the Higgins, the officers exchanged tense looks. The commanding officer gave his reply in calm, clipped tones. This is the USS Higgins, United States Navy destroyer conducting lawful operations in international waters, consistent with international law. We will maintain our course. The words were routine, yet behind them lay a gamble, a calculated defiance, knowing that every refusal amplified the risk of confrontation. The close quarters dance. For minutes that stretched like hours, the two vessels moved in a dangerous ballet. The Chinese ship crept closer, its shadow lengthening across the Higgins deck. Distance narrowed 300 yards, then 200, then less than 150, dangerously close in naval terms. On the Higgins Bridge, sailors tracked every movement, the angle of the enemy ship's bow, the churn of its wake, the sudden flicker of exhaust that hinted at acceleration. In such encounters, even a single misjudgment of speed or trajectory could mean disaster. And then naught happened. The Chinese warship abruptly cut across the Higgins bow, angling sharply at what seemed like reckless speed. A steel sliced through the waves, throwing up walls of spray. Gasps erupted among the American crew. Calculations flashed through their minds at that distance. There was barely a ship's length between collision and catastrophe. The helmsman of the Higgins adjusted with trained precision, pulling back just enough to avoid impact. The destroyer trembled under the sudden maneuver, its bow slicing into the turbulent wake left behind. On deck, sailors gripped rails, their eyes locked on the menacing silhouette crossing their path. Shockwaves across the decks. For an instant, silence reigned. Even the constant hum of engines seemed muffled by the weight of what had almost transpired. On both ships, hearts pounded not, out of fear alone, but from the realization that history had nearly shifted course in that split second. On the Higgins, a petty officer muttered under his breath, "God, we were inches from war." The words hung in the air like smoke. Everyone knew he was right. A collision at sea, intentional or not, between two nuclear-armed superpowers was unthinkable. Yet here they were, one careless maneuver away from unleashing a chain of events that could engulf the entire region, if not the world. Beijing's gamble. From the Chinese perspective, the maneuver was more than intimidation, which theater. Cameras aboard the planned vessel captured every angle. Evidence to be broadcast back home to show the people that China was standing firm, forcing the Americans to flinch. But Beijing was also playing a dangerous game. Every aggressive tactic carried the risk of miscalculation, of sparking an incident that could spiral beyond anyone's control. By ordering its captains to push limits, China projected strength but also revealed a willingness to gamble with peace. For Washington, the message was equally clear. The U.S. Navy would not be bullied. The Higgins course held steady, its bridge crew visibly shaken but resolute. The near miss did not divert them. Instead, it underscored why they were there, to prove that no single nation could turn open waters into a private lake. Echoes of history. The standoff stirred memories of other maritime crises, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Cold War submarine encounters, the Black Sea bumping incidents between the U.S. and Soviet Union. History had shown how easily ships brushing steel could ignite diplomatic firestorms. In 2001, a U.S. surveillance plane collided with a Chinese fighter jet over the South China Sea, killing the Chinese pilot and forcing the American plane to make an emergency landing on Hainan Island. That single incident sparked weeks of international uproar. Here in 2025, the stakes were even higher. This time, the confrontation was not accidental, it was a test of wills. The aftermath. After the maneuver, the Chinese ship pulled back slightly, resuming its circling pattern. But the point had been made. Beijing was willing to risk lives and vessels to assert its claims. On the Higgins, the captain addressed the crew over the intercom. His voice was steady, but beneath it lay the gravity of what they had just endured. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you witnessed today was dangerous, reckless, and deliberate. But we held our ground. We will continue our mission, calm, professional, and unshaken." The crew responded with silence, not out of fear, but in recognition of the razor's edge they now walked. A global audience watches. What few knew at the time was that drones, satellites, and listening posts from multiple nations were watching the encounter unfold in real time. Intelligence centers from Washington to Manila to Tokyo tracked every move. Reports would soon make headlines across the world with grainy footage and radar tracks telling the story of a near war at sea for global powers. The message was chilling. The South China Sea had become not just a geopolitical fault line, but a live-wire battlefield where one wrong move could light the fuse. And for the people living in the shadow of these waters, fishermen, traders, islanders, an incident underscored a terrifying truth. Their livelihoods, even their safety, depended on the restraint of warships sailing just beyond the horizon. The near collision was not just a close call, it was a warning. The fragile balance of peace now rested on decisions made in split seconds by sailors under immense pressure. Both Washington and Beijing had stared into the abyss and stepped back. But the confrontation had set the stage for an even deeper question. How long before another reckless move pushes the world past the point of no return? Chapter 5. The Radio Duel. The South China Sea was no longer silent. After the near collision between the USS Higgins and the Chinese destroyer, the air itself seemed charged with static, as if the ocean had turned into a battlefield of nerves. Both navies knew one wrong move could spiral into an international crisis. But in modern naval confrontations, battles are not always fought with missiles or torpedoes. They often begin with words. And so began the radio duel. The first transmission crackled across the open channel, its Mandarin accent clipped and unmistakably forceful. U.S. warship. This is the People's Liberation Army Navy. You are violating Chinese sovereignty. Leave immediately, or you will bear full responsibility for the consequences. The voice was stern, but beneath it was a carefully crafted tone of projection of authority designed to unnerve the American crew. It was not just a warning, it was a test of will. On the bridge of the Higgins, the radio operator glanced at the commanding officer. The crew had drilled for this exact scenario. The captain nodded once, calm but sharp-eyed. Then came the reply, delivered in flawless Navy Standard English, steady and clear. Chinese warship, this is USS Higgins, a United States Navy destroyer conducting lawful operations in international waters under international law. We will continue our transit as planned. Over. No wavering, no apology. The Higgins captain knew every word would be dissected later by lawyers, politicians, and admirals back home. But for now, what mattered was tone. The Americans would show resolve without inviting escalation. The Chinese warship answered quickly, this time sharper, almost mocking. Us destroyer, you are in the waters of the People's Republic of China. You are trespassing. You must change course immediately. Do not test our patience. The Higgins held her course. On deck, sailors stood at their posts, scanning the horizon. 2 Chinese frigates had now joined the shadowing operation, their gray hulls slicing through the waves in tight formation. To the Americans, it felt like being circled by wolves. Then another transmission louder, as if to broadcast dominance. This is your final warning. Alter course, or you will face action. The tension inside the Higgins was palpable. Every sailor knew the meaning behind those words. In international maritime law, final warning carried no official weight, but politically, it was a line in the sand. The American response came back calm, almost clinical, as though recited from a manual. Chinese warship, your claims are not recognized under international law. We will not alter course. We are conducting a freedom of navigation operation consistent with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Over. The phrasing was deliberate. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a global signal. Anyone listening to the open frequency, from commercial tankers to regional navies, would hear that the U.S. was standing firm under the rules of the international order. But the Chinese were not finished. Their next broadcast was different. Not an order, but a taunt. Us warship. Your presence here is a provocation. You are surrounded. Do you really wish to be remembered as the ones who brought conflict to the South China Sea? On the bridge, the Americans exchanged looks. Psychological warfare. The Chinese were trying to push them off balance to make the crew second-guess their mission. The U.S. captain leaned into the mic himself this time, voice cool as steel. Chinese warship, we are operating peacefully in accordance with international law. Any attempt to interfere with this passage would be unsafe and unprofessional. The responsibility for escalation lies with you. Over. The words hit their mark. He had shifted the burden of aggression back to the Chinese. If shots were ever fired, history would judge who had acted first. As the hours wore on, the radio exchanges continued like volleys in a duel firm orders. Legal justifications, veiled threats, and counter-threats. Neither side backed down. Every transmission carried weight far beyond the ocean, reaching policymakers in Beijing, Washington, and allied capitals across the world. For the crews, though, the duel was more than politics. It was personal. Each man and woman aboard the Higgins felt the Chinese voices reverberate through the steel walls of their ship. It was a reminder that they were thousands of miles from home, standing toe-to-toe with a rising power determined to push them out. And for the Chinese sailors, the American voice was just as imposing. A reminder that the U.S. Navy, with its century-long dominance of the seas, still had the resolve to sail wherever it chose. The duel of words was as dangerous as any missile exchange. A single slip of phrase too aggressive, a tone too mocking could be interpreted as a challenge. In naval encounters, escalation often begins not with weapons but with pride. By the time dusk fell, the radio had gone quiet, though the Chinese ships remained close. The duel had ended in a stalemate, each side refusing to yield. But the silence was not relief. It was the silence before the next storm. For if words had failed to move either side, what would come next? Chapter 6. The Night Standoff. Darkness fell over the South China Sea like a heavy cloak, swallowing the waves in shadow. For the sailors aboard the USS Higgins, the day's relentless tension had not dissolved with the sunset. It had only thickened. The contested waters were silent in the distance, but the silence was deceptive, a quiet that carried the weight of coiled steel and hidden intentions. Radar screens glowed in the dimly lit Combat Information Center, each blip carrying meaning. One marked the Higgins, steady on her lawful course. Others represented the silhouettes of Chinese warships, still lurking, still circling, refusing to retreat even as the black sky pressed down over them. The ocean was vast, but the space between the two forces felt suffocatingly small. On deck, the sailors could feel it in their bones. This was not just another patrol. Flares fired by the Chinese warships lit up the night intermittently, their bright orange streaks reflecting off the restless waters. They weren't meant for illumination. They were signals, warnings, psychological intimidation. Each burst over the ocean reminded the Higgins crew that they were not alone, that eyes were watching them from just beyond the horizon. The Higgins responded in kind, not with flares, but with steady professionalism. Her radar systems swept constantly, her deck lights dimmed to combat settings. The American destroyer was not there to provoke, but neither would she be intimidated into silence. The crew moved with purpose, every action deliberate, every order crisp. No one wanted to make the wrong move tonight. Inside the bridge, the mood was razor-sharp. Captain Walters stood by the forward windows, scanning the sea through night vision binoculars. The green glow outlined the faint shadows of Chinese vessels holding steady too close for comfort. One ship, a sleek Chinese Type 052D destroyer, maintained a parallel course barely a few thousand yards away. Any sudden turn by either side could spell disaster. "Chinese vessel holding steady on our starboard quarter," reported the officer of the deck. Walters nodded, his jaw tight. "Keep speed and heading. No deviations unless ordered." But the Chinese had their own ideas. Over the radio, broken English filled the air again, this time colder, sharper than before. "Foreign warship, you are in Chinese waters. Turn away immediately or face consequences." The voice echoed in the tight space of the bridge, and though the words were familiar by now, their menace felt amplified under the cover of darkness. The Higgins responded with calm precision, her communications officer reading the scripted U.S. Navy reply like a steady drumbeat. This is United States Navy warship conducting lawful operations in international waters under international law. We will continue on our course. It was a script both sides knew by heart, but tonight the tone was different. Tonight every syllable vibrated with the awareness that one mistake, a slip of the helm, a misunderstood signal could spark a chain reaction that no radio operator could talk down. As midnight approached, the atmosphere thickened into something surreal. Radar locks from both sides lit up control consoles, electronic pings bouncing invisibly through the air. American sailors could see the data. The Chinese ships had fire control radars trained on them. Not weapons fired, not yet, but the electronic equivalent of cocking a pistol and holding it steady on someone's chest. The Higgins responded by bringing her own systems online. Missile tubes primed, gun mounts rotated to alert positions. The destroyer was not looking for a fight, but she would not be caught unprepared. The crew barely breathed. They had trained for war, but war in the dark, this kind of close-in, radar-to-radar standoff, was the stuff of naval nightmares. One nervous finger, one misinterpreted maneuver, and history could record this night as the spark of a larger conflict. On deck, lookouts whispered among themselves, their voices hushed as if even sound might provoke the ocean into violence. They watched as Chinese vessels fired another series of flares, this time closer. Streaks of burning light hissing over the water and landing with loud splashes near the destroyer's path. It was more than a warning now. It was a dare. Captain Walters didn't flinch. His command was simple, steady, maintain course, maintain professionalism. We are not the ones who will blink first. The night dragged on, an endless standoff painted in shadows and sparks. The ocean seemed frozen, the stars overhead silent witnesses to the powder keg below. In every compartment of the Higgins, sailors remained at their stations, adrenaline coursing through their veins, knowing they were part of something that could define history. And so they held Americans and Chinese locked in a deadly quiet, neither willing to move, neither willing to back down. The sea itself seemed to wait, trembling at the edge of chaos. The dawn would bring clarity. But in the suffocating dark of the South China Sea, the standoff stretched on, hour by tense hour, as two great powers stared each other down across the waves. Chapter 7. Dawn Tensions. The night had been long, endless hours of radar pings, tense radio chatter, and the constant hum of engines as steel leviathans drifted ever closer under a blanket of darkness. But as the first light of dawn stretched across the horizon, South China Sea revealed a chilling truth. The USS Higgins and the Chinese warships were locked in a standoff so perilously close that a single mistake, a misread maneuver, or even a rogue wave could have sent thousands of tons of steel crashing together. When the sun rose that morning, its golden light struck the gray silhouettes of destroyers and frigates in eerie detail. Now, what had been shadows on radar screens became visible reality's painted hulls. Naval flags snapping in the warm sea breeze, and the faint outlines of watchstanders on open decks. Both sides had kept their battle stations manned through the night, and the fatigue was now visible. American sailors sipped from their coffee mugs, hands trembling not just from caffeine but from the pressure of knowing they were one wrong move away from international catastrophe. On the Chinese ships, sailors in crisp white uniforms lined the rails, binoculars fixed on the Higgins. They were not simply observers. They were a display of defiance. By daylight, the Chinese Navy wanted the Americans to see just how many eyes were watching them, how many cameras were recording every turn of their rudder, every rotation of their guns. The distance between the two sides was shocking. In some spots, less than a few hundred meters separated billion-dollar warships. At sea, that was practically a handshake, close enough that the roar of a diesel engine or the clatter of chains carried across the water. A Higgins officer later recalled, "We could literally see the expressions on their faces. That's how close we were." They weren't bluffing. We weren't bluffing either. We just stared at each other, waiting for Hood flinch first. By mid-morning, the sunlight revealed scars on the ocean's surface, churned wakes from aggressive maneuvers the night before. Foamy trails where ships had pushed their engines hard to block or shadow one another. It was as though the sea itself bore witness to their silent clash of wills. The American crew adjusted their posture. Deck guns were rotated slightly off-center but clearly ready. Missile tubes glinted in the daylight, and watchstanders gripped their rifles with white knuckles. On the bridge, the Higgins captain knew this was no longer a routine freedom of navigation operation. It had become a live geopolitical poker game where every card was on the table. Meanwhile, the Chinese commander issued his own orders. Their ships closed into an intimidating formation, circling like wolves. Some passed so close to the Higgins that their wakes rocked the destroyer, causing American sailors to grip rails and curse under their breath. And yet, neither side fired, neither side blinked. It was a deadly game of patience and nerve. At dawn's full light, journalists in the region began picking up whispers. Civilian vessels spotted the naval standoff. Fishing boats reported unusual activity, and soon, chatter rippled across military channels in nearby bases. By then, the world had no idea how close the U.S. and China were to an incident that could have spiraled into something far greater. For the crews, though, there was no escaping the reality before their eyes. The South China Sea, place of coral reefs and turquoise waters, had become a pressure cooker. The sailors saw not just rival ships, but the embodiment of national pride and global power staring back at them. In those morning hours, every creak of metal, every splash of wave, every bark of a radio call carried the weight of history. Dawn had not eased tensions. It had only stripped away the shadows, forcing both navies to confront the dangerous intimacy of their confrontation. The world's two greatest powers were not just contesting international law, they were literally eyeball to eyeball, staring the other to make the first move. And in those quiet sunlit hours, the question loomed larger than ever. Would one ship miscalculate and light the match that could ignite the Pacific? Chapter 8. The Diplomatic Shockwaves. The first hints of the standoff reached Washington just before dawn on the East Coast. At the Pentagon, reports filtered through encrypted channels. USS Higgins shadowed. Multiple Chinese destroyers in close contact. Collision nearly avoided. The terse situation brief sent a chill through senior officers. This wasn't just another freedom of navigation patrol. This was different. This was perilously close to catastrophe. Inside the National Military Command Center, red phones lit up. Analysts huddled over live satellite imagery, tracking the Higgins course in near real time. From the South China Sea, U.S. Navy relays reported urgent updates. Chinese vessels refusing to back down. Radar locks confirmed, and the unsettling possibility of deliberate provocation. The question hung heavy in the room. Had the U.S. just stumbled into a potential naval war with China? At the White House, the Situation Room was quickly activated. Advisors briefed the president. "Sir, the Higgins is boxed in. The Chinese are aggressively maneuvering. One misstep, and we could see an armed exchange." A map of the contested waters glowed on the screen. The room fell silent as military chiefs explained the rules of engagement, what the crew was authorized to do, and more importantly, what they weren't. The president's jaw tightened. This was no drill. Meanwhile, in Beijing, the incident was being monitored just as closely. Inside the Central Military Commission, top generals reviewed the feeds coming in from Chinese warships. One commander, standing stiffly in his uniform, declared, "The Americans are trespassing. We must teach them a lesson." Others counseled restraint, warning that open fire would trigger a U.S. response unlike anything China had faced in decades. Still, the official line hardened. The People's Liberation Army Navy was to stand firm and repel all intrusions. Chinese state media began to quietly prepare talking points. Drafts of fiery headlines circulated. U.S. destroyer provokes China in our own waters. Nationalistic rhetoric simmered, meant to rally domestic support. It's back down now, in the eyes of Beijing's leadership. It would be to lose face not only at home, but also across Asia. The timing was terrible. Regional allies were watching every move, wondering whether China could truly dominate its claimed seas, or if the U.S. would continue to sail unchallenged. Across the Pacific, the news leaked into the public sphere sooner than either side had hoped. Within hours, global media outlets picked up fragments of the story. CNN ran a breaking headline: U.S. warship in high-stakes standoff with Chinese Navy. In Tokyo and Manila, governments scrambled to get clarity. Were shots fired? Was a collision inevitable? The uncertainty was almost as destabilizing as the facts. In the Philippines, President and senior defense officials held emergency meetings. Their bases hosted American forces, but their territory was uncomfortably close to the flashpoint. If this escalates, we are the front line, one general muttered. Japan, too, was alarmed. Prime Minister and cabinet members met in Tokyo, recognizing that any conflict in the South China Sea would immediately ripple into the East China Sea, where Japan already had its own tense disputes with Beijing. At the United Nations, whispers began among diplomats. Some feared that, if the standoff spiraled out of control, it could represent the most serious confrontation between the U.S. and China in modern history. The Security Council braced for emergency sessions. Allies pressed Washington for updates, while China quietly instructed its ambassadors abroad to frame the narrative. America was the aggressor, not them. Back on the Higgins, the crew remained unaware of just how much their tense night had shaken capitals worldwide. For them, the standoff was a test of survival and professionalism. For leaders in Washington and Beijing, it was a test of national will. Both sides were caught in a high-stakes chess match where backing down too quickly could look like weakness, but escalating could mean global catastrophe. Behind closed doors, phone lines crackled as urgent diplomatic back channels opened. A senior U.S. envoy called Beijing with a stark message: "We don't want war, but we will not be intimidated." Chinese counterparts responded in equally firm tones: "Withdraw your warship. This is our territory. You are provoking conflict." Neither side blinked. The standoff at sea had now become more than a naval confrontation. It was a symbol of the larger struggle for supremacy in the Pacific. Allies watched nervously. Rivals calculated opportunistic moves. Markets jittered, fearing that if shots were exchanged, oil tankers and trade routes could be caught in the crossfire. The world was on edge, pulled into a crisis sparked by steel holes and salt water, but fueled by pride, power, and geopolitics. By dawn in Washington and dusk in Beijing, it was clear. The standoff was no longer just a matter for sailors and destroyers. It was now a global incident, one that would test the limits of diplomacy, military restraint, and political nerve. The Higgins and the Chinese warships still held their positions, but the shockwaves had already spread far beyond the South China Sea. The ocean was tense, the world was watching. And both nations stood at the precipice of a confrontation that neither could afford but neither seemed willing to avoid. Chapter 9: The Global Media Frenzy. If the South China Sea had been a powder keg the night before, by morning it had become a spectacle for the entire world. Satellite imagery, amateur radio intercepts, and even grainy cell phone videos from nearby commercial vessels began circulating online. Before long, the story broke on global news networks. U.S. Navy destroyer confronted by Chinese warships in South China Sea. Flashed across screens in New York, London, Manila, and Sydney. The standoff between the USS Higgins and the Chinese planned destroyers was no longer a military secret, had become a global headline. In Washington, journalists stormed the Pentagon press room, hurling urgent questions. Is the U.S. prepared to fire if challenged again? In Beijing, state media wasted no time portraying the incident as proof of American provocation. Within hours, Chinese news anchors, framed against the glowing red and gold of the national flag, declared that China had successfully defended its sovereignty against foreign intrusion. But on social media, the narrative fractured into countless versions. On Twitter, or X, as it was now called, hashtags like hashtag South China Sea Crisis, hashtag USSV's plan, and hashtag World War III began trending. In Southeast Asia, ordinary citizens debated nervously. Was this just another naval encounter, or the spark that might ignite a war in their backyard? Memes, infographics, and shaky analysis spread like wildfire, mixing fact with speculation. On TikTok, a short clip of two warships circling each other dangerously close shot by a Filipino fisherman who had been miles away garnered millions of views in hours. In comments below, young people around the world debated the fate of the two superpowers. Some joking darkly about WW3 speedruns, others expressing genuine fear. CNN broadcast retired admirals and defense analysts who warned that the incident was the closest we've come to a direct clash with China in decades. BBC News ran maps of the contested waters, reminding viewers that $3 trillion worth of global trade passed through the South China Sea annually. Al Jazeera highlighted the perspectives of Southeast Asian nations, countries like Vietnam and the Philippines, that were caught between two giants. Meanwhile, Fox News emphasized America's resolve. The U.S. Navy doesn't back down. Period. In contrast, Chinese state-run Global Times published fiery op-eds declaring that foreign intruders who test China's resolve must be prepared for consequences. But the frenzy wasn't limited to newsrooms. Markets around the world quivered under the weight of uncertainty. Oil prices jumped. Asian stock markets dipped sharply. Shipping companies began quietly instructing their captains to reroute away from the disputed waters. Insurance companies debated raising premiums on vessels crossing the South China Sea. For the sailors themselves, the American crew of the USS Higgins and the Chinese crews shadowing them, news of this media explosion filtered back slowly through secure lines. But when it did, the mood shifted. Suddenly, they realized their every move was being watched, not only by governments, but by millions of ordinary people glued to screens worldwide. A collision, a misfire, even a poorly timed warning flare could now ripple into an international catastrophe that no one could contain. The frenzy also created political traps. Leaders in both capitals knew they were now cornered by public perception. In Washington, any hint of retreat might be painted as weakness against China. In Beijing, failing to defend sacred sovereignty could be seen as national humiliation. The media had turned a dangerous standoff at sea into a test of pride and prestige for two superpowers. And so, the global spotlight burned brighter. The USS Higgins still held its line. The Chinese destroyers still circled and watched. And millions of people, ordinary citizens far from the contested waters, waited with nervous curiosity for the next headline. The next shaky video, or the first shot fired. The standoff was no longer just about contested reefs and maritime rights. It was now about image, narrative, and perception. A battle had begun, not of missiles and torpedoes, but of stories spinning simultaneously in Washington, Beijing, and every corner of the connected world. And everyone watching knew. The wrong headline tomorrow could start a war today. Chapter 10. The Brink of War. The crisis that had begun as a tense naval standoff in the South China Sea had now spiraled into something far more dangerous, a moment where two of the world's greatest powers stood on the knife's edge of conflict. The USS Higgins, a single American destroyer, was no longer just a warship conducting a routine freedom of navigation operation. It had become the fulcrum of global security. The flashpoint around which the destinies of Washington and Beijing seemed to collide. In the Pentagon, the Situation Room glowed with screens streaming live intelligence. Satellite images showed the Higgins boxed in by 3 Chinese warships, their wakes churning in overlapping patterns like sharks circling prey. On one monitor, a live feed from a P-8 Poseidon reconnaissance plane provided a chilling view. The distance between the vessels was now so narrow that the slightest miscalculation could end in a collision or worse, an exchange of fire. Defense Secretary briefs were terse and urgent. The question looming over the table was clear. How far should the U.S. go? Hawks within the room urged reinforcement. "We have a carrier group in striking range," one admiral declared. "They push this any further, we can send in the Ronald Reagan battle group within hours." But others urged restraint, warning that introducing more ships into the boiling waters would risk turning a dangerous encounter into outright war. Across the Pacific, Beijing's Central Military Commission was locked in its own high-stakes debate. To China's leadership, the Higgins was not just an intruder, it was a direct challenge to sovereignty. A test of China's resolve in its own backyard. State media had already begun framing the event as an American provocation, fueling nationalist fervor at home. Hardliners in the room demanded decisive action, to board the American vessel, to force it away, even to fire warning shots across its bow. Yet cooler heads cautioned that any such escalation would be exactly what Washington wanted: a pretext to paint China as the aggressor on the world stage. Still, the reality was stark. Both governments were boxed in by pride and perception. Neither could afford to be seen as backing down. The U.S., bound by decades of commitment to freedom of navigation and alliance credibility in Asia, could not simply order the Higgins to retreat. China, staking its legitimacy on defending what it called its blue national soil, could not permit an American destroyer to steam unchallenged through contested waters. Meanwhile, military channels buzzed with urgency. In Guam, American fighter squadrons were put on standby. In Okinawa, Marines quietly shifted from training exercises into readiness status. And aboard the Higgins, the crew knew the weight of history pressed upon them. They were no longer sailors on routine patrol. They were potential first actors in a war neither side wanted, but both seemed locked into. As dawn passed into midday, both governments began testing off-ramps. U.S. diplomats sent urgent cables to Beijing, offering the language of de-escalation, proposing face-saving solutions that might allow both sides to step back without appearing weak. Chinese envoys in Washington relayed messages laced with the careful art of ambiguity. Threats couched in polite phrasing, ultimatums hidden in diplomatic nuance. Yet time was running short. Every hour that the destroyer remained pinned down in the South China Sea, the danger of a miscalculation grew. A sudden engine surge, a misinterpreted radar lock. Even an overheard radio transmission out of context, one of these could light the fuse. In Washington, the president convened the National Security Council. "We are staring at the possibility of a naval firefight," one senior advisor warned grimly. "If shots are fired, there is no guarantee this stays regional. We could be looking at escalation that reaches the Taiwan Strait, the East China Sea, even the Pacific itself." Silence fell across the room. The reality was unthinkable, yet undeniable. The world stood closer to great power war than at any time in decades. Back in Beijing, the question was put directly to the highest leader. Shall we force them out? The answer, slow and deliberate, carried the weight of a nation. Not yet. But we will not be humiliated. If they make one false move, we strike. The world held its breath. The USS Higgins remained surrounded, her guns trained yet silent. Her crew braced for orders that might never come. Chinese destroyers cut through the waters around her, their flags snapping defiantly in the wind. And somewhere between Washington and Beijing, amid the clash of national interests, the fate of peace itself teetered on the edge of a knife. At this point, the world was not just watching, was waiting for a decision, for a spark, for the moment when brinkmanship might collapse into catastrophe. The question on every lip, from sailor to statesman, was chillingly simple. What happens if the first shot is fired? Chapter 11. Back-channel Diplomacy. While the world's cameras were fixated on the flashing images of destroyers at sea and heated rhetoric on primetime news, another battle was quietly being waged, not with missiles or torpedoes, but with words, whispers, and carefully chosen gestures. This was the hidden front, the realm of back-channel diplomacy. In Washington, the Situation Room remained tense. The president had been briefed hourly since the standoff began. and the Joint Chiefs pushed options ranging from freedom of navigation, shows of force to economic retaliation. Yet not everyone in the room wanted to escalate. The National Security Advisor, a seasoned diplomat, reminded the room that even the most sophisticated war plans could not guarantee control once the shooting started. A single miscalculation at sea, gentlemen, and we're looking at a war neither side truly wants, he warned. Meanwhile, in Beijing's Zhang Nanai leadership compound, a similar debate raged. Hardliners urged the Politburo Standing Committee to seize the moment, to assert dominance over the South China Sea by pushing the Americans out once and for all. But others, including the foreign minister, quietly urged caution. China had too much at stake economically. An open conflict with the United States would risk not only war but also global isolation. Still, pride was a powerful force. No Chinese leader wanted to be seen as backing down. And so both sides began to search for off-ramps that did not look like retreat. The first lifeline came through neutral intermediaries. Singapore, long a friend to both navies, quietly relayed messages. In hushed phone calls, envoys spoke in deliberately vague terms. Stability is in everyone's interest. Escalation benefits no one. Misunderstandings must be contained. The Swiss and even the Vatican signaled willingness to serve as discreet mediators. But the real breakthrough began not in official halls, but in military-to-military hotlines, channels rarely used but never shut down. Late at night in Beijing, a red phone rang inside the Plie Navy headquarters. On the other end was a U.S. Pacific Fleet liaison officer. The tone was clipped, but respectful. "We don't want this to escalate, neither do you. Let's establish some space, literally, between our ships." It wasn't easy. Hours of negotiations followed, sometimes circling in maddening loops. Each side demanded concessions the other couldn't accept. The Americans insisted that Higgins would complete its mission unhindered. The Chinese demanded it vacate what they called Chinese waters. Neither side budged. But even amid this stalemate, small signals of restraint emerged. Chinese captains received orders not to cross a certain distance. Us commanders were quietly told to avoid provocative maneuvers. Back in Washington, the State Department drafted a statement, deliberately bland, calling for respect for international law and freedom of navigation. In Beijing, the Foreign Ministry rehearsed its own press release, emphasizing China's commitment to peace and stability. Both were lies of omission, but they created breathing room. In Tokyo, Canberra, and Brussels, allies worked phones day and night. Japan feared that a miscalculation near the Philippines could spill into its own maritime backyard. Australia, deeply tied to U.S. defense, urged restraint. Even NATO's Secretary General weighed in, framing the standoff as a test of global order. The irony was clear. While destroyers circled each other in the South China Sea, the true clash was happening in offices, filled with diplomats, analysts, and negotiators who knew that one wrong word could be as deadly as a misfired missile. By the second night of crisis, an informal framework emerged. The Higgins would not retreat, but it would slow its transit. The planned warships would maintain shadowing, but not close the gap further. Both governments would downplay the confrontation publicly, while continuing intense private talks. The world would never see the sweat on the brows of the negotiators, or hear the frustration in the muffled curses when talks stalled. But in those hidden exchanges, the fate of thousands of sailors and perhaps millions of lives hung in the balance. And yet, even as whispers of compromise floated between capitals, one question loomed large. Could words really hold back the tide of nationalism, pride, and mistrust now unleashed? The next chapter would reveal whether diplomacy was enough, or whether the world would be pulled past the point of no return. Chapter 12. The Narrow Escape. The ocean was deceptively calm as the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the South China Sea in streaks of gold and crimson. Yet beneath the shimmering surface, the waters remained a cauldron of tension. For days, the USS Higgins and the Chinese warships had stared each other down, locked in a perilous maritime standoff that threatened to ignite the most dangerous military confrontation between the United States and China in decades. Now, the world was holding its breath, desperate for a resolution. Inside the Pentagon, the Situation Room buzzed with urgency. Maps of the South China Sea glowed on digital screens, annotated with the positions of American and Chinese vessels, drones, and aircraft. Senior U.S. defense officials debated scenarios that ranged from calibrated shows of force to full-scale naval engagement. But the overwhelming consensus was clear. A miscalculation now could spiral into catastrophic war. On the other side of the Pacific, Beijing's John and I compound was equally tense. President Xi Jinping had been briefed repeatedly, each update painting the Higgins not as an isolated destroyer, but as a symbol of American defiance at China's doorstep. Hardliners in the People's Liberation Army Navy plan urged decisive action, arguing that letting the Higgins sail unchallenged would embolden Washington and weaken Beijing's claims. But diplomats and senior party officials counseled restraint. The stakes were too high. For the sailors aboard the Higgins, none of this grand strategy mattered. What they knew was simple. Chinese ships still loomed dangerously close. Their crews visible through binoculars, their radar beams painting the destroyer like a target. Every clang of metal, every burst of static over the radio felt like the moment before a storm. Many sailors had quietly written letters home, just in case the next sunrise never came. Then, quietly but decisively, back-channel diplomacy began to stir. Unknown to the crews at sea, secure lines were opened between Washington and Beijing. Messages were exchanged not in public statements, but in carefully worded diplomatic cables and encrypted calls. At first, neither side yielded. China demanded the Higgins reverse course and leave what it called its sovereign waters. The U.S. refused, insisting on its legal right to conduct freedom of navigation operations. But as the hours dragged into another tense night, something shifted. Both capitals realized that neither side wanted war, at least not today. The risk of escalation had simply grown too great. Reports from intelligence analysts warned that social media was ablaze with rumors of an imminent clash, fueling nationalist fervor in both countries. Global markets had begun to wobble, with oil prices spiking and Asian stock indexes tumbling. The pressure was becoming unbearable. A compromise began to take shape. China would gradually ease its aggressive shadowing, pulling its warships back to a less provocative distance. In return, the Higgins would maintain its course but refrain from further maneuvers that might be seen as deliberately provocative. The arrangement was fragile, unwritten, and fraught with ambiguity, but it offered the slimmest of lifelines. Shortly after midnight, the first signs of de-escalation appeared. One Chinese frigate that had been circling close peeled away, turning eastward toward Hainan Island. Another vessel slowed its pace, allowing the Higgins a little more breathing room. On the American side, the Higgins captain deliberately reduced speed and avoided any maneuvers that might suggest aggression. Both sides were still locked in a silent contest of nerves, but the distance, literal and symbolic, was widening. By dawn, the standoff had not ended, but it had eased. The Higgins still sailed in contested waters, its flag waving defiantly in the morning light. The Chinese ship still shadowed, but with less intensity, as though under quiet orders to stand down without losing face. It was not peace, it was not even resolution. But it was enough to avert disaster. In Washington, officials exhaled relief, though no one declared victory. In Beijing, state media remained silent, carefully omitting mention of how close the crisis had come to boiling over. For the sailors at sea, the sense of reprieve was palpable. A few dared to laugh again. A few allowed themselves to believe they might actually make it home. But even as the tension ebbed, a lingering truth remained. The world had skirted the edge of catastrophe. Saved not by trust, but by the cold calculation that war would cost too much. The deal was a bandage, not a cure. The South China Sea remained a powder keg. The narrow escape of the Higgins would be remembered as both a lesson and a warning. Chapter 13. The Aftermath. The roar of engines had faded. The white wakes of destroyers dissolved into the vast gray sea. The South China Sea, once moments away from becoming the ignition point of a global conflict, had fallen eerily quiet. But the echoes of the standoff lingered far louder than the sound of any warship's turbines. In Washington, Beijing, and capitals across the globe, leaders sat in silence as their intelligence briefings replayed the harrowing hours in chilling detail. For all their technological prowess, both superpowers had discovered a truth as old as human rivalry itself. Even the most disciplined navies could stumble, and a single misstep could ignite catastrophe. The fragile deal that allowed both fleets to disengage was a bandage, not a cure. The world now wrestled with what had just happened and what it meant for the future. Analysts sound the alarm. In think tanks from Washington to Singapore, military analysts pored over radar tracks and satellite images. The data revealed just how close disaster had come, ships within 50 yards of each other at sea. Jets with missiles armed flying overhead, commanders with fingers hovering over trigger switches. Some compared it to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, when humanity last teetered so close to the nuclear abyss. But unlike that standoff, the South China Sea incident unfolded in real time before a hyper-connected world, where every move was broadcast and amplified through social media. This was a wake-up call. One retired admiral warned on CNN, a single degree of rudder, a split-second miscalculation, and we'd be talking about casualties, not close calls. Beijing's reflection. Inside Zhongnonai, China's leadership weighed the fallout. The People's Liberation Army Navy had demonstrated resolve, but also revealed recklessness. Footage of planned destroyers swerving within collision range had gone viral, casting Beijing not only as powerful, but also dangerously provocative. China's diplomats scrambled to soften the image, insisting their navy acted to defend sovereignty, while blaming the U.S. for provoking confrontation. Yet, behind closed doors, some Chinese officials quietly admitted the encounter risked undoing years of carefully staged naval buildup. Would allies in Asia now view China as a guardian of order or as a destabilizing force? The question gnawed at Beijing's strategists. Washington's dilemma. Meanwhile, in the Pentagon, commanders studied the incident with a mix of relief and dread. Relief that USS Higgins and her crew had returned unscathed. Dread at the realization that next time, they might not be so lucky. The incident galvanized hawks in Congress who argued for a stronger military presence in the Pacific, even as diplomats pushed for new rules of the road at sea. Some urged President and his Security Council to consider whether America's commitment to freedom of navigation was worth flirting with World War III. The debate was not about whether the U.S. should stay engaged in the Pacific, but about how far it was willing to go in challenging Beijing's claims. The view from the region. Across Southeast Asia, smaller nations watched with a mixture of awe and terror. For Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia, countries whose own claims overlapped with China. The standoff underscored both their dependence on American power and the risks of being caught between giants. Ordinary citizens felt it too. Fishermen in Palawan, oil workers in Brunei, cargo crews in Singapore. They all knew that their livelihoods sailed across the same waters where two superpowers had nearly gone to war. A Filipino fisherman put it simply to a local news station: "The sea is our life. But when the giants fight, it is always the small boats that sink first." Public perception. A divided world. On social media, the incident became a global spectacle. In America, many praised the Higgins crew as heroes who had stood tall against aggression. In China, patriotic posts glorified their navy's bravery in the face of foreign intrusion. But outside the echo chambers, ordinary people were left unsettled. Parents whispered to each other if they had fired, "Would my children be safe?" Students in Europe asked, "Are we watching the first sparks of World War III?" In both East and West, fear lingered, fear that the oceans were no longer a vast barrier keeping peace, but instead the front lines of a future war. The unanswered question. As the days turned to weeks, both navies resumed patrols. The diplomatic storm gradually settled. Yet the waters themselves remained unchanged, disputed, contested, claimed by many, but owned by none. The standoff ended without shots fired, but not without scars. Trust was eroded. Suspicion deepened. The rules of engagement grew tighter, yet the gap for miscalculation remained perilously wide. One chilling truth became clear. The South China Sea had not just been the site of a near war, it had become the testing ground for the 21st century's balance of power. A final reflection. History often remembers wars that happened. Rarely does it remember the wars that almost did. Yet this moment, the night when destroyers stared each other down, when commanders' voices trembled through static-filled radios, when the world unknowingly stood on the edge of the abyss, would echo through time. It was a reminder that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the restraint to hold back when conflict feels inevitable. The South China Sea, shimmering under the rising sun, remains a stage for that test of restraint. And while this chapter closed without fire and fury, no one can say with certainty what the next chapter will hold. The aftershocks of the near war continue to ripple outward, reminding the world that the line between peace and chaos is as thin and as fragile as the waves that lap against a warship's hull.